I was recently at the Royal Armouries in Leeds in the UK with the Curator of European Edged Weapons, Iason Tzouriadis, and so I had the rare opportunity to talk to him about Cinquedea, which is particularly appropriate because the new replica collaboration between the Royal Armouries, me and Windlass, is now available for pre-order. Links down below. Check out those links down there. So let's see this interview and find out more about the amazing late 15th and early 16th century Italian short sword family known as the Cinquedea. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now I'm at the Royal Armouries with Iason Tzouriadis.
Hello Matt, I am the Curator of European Edged Weapons here at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, and I'm glad to be joining you with these amazing weapons that we have here.
Yeah, so we've been doing some filming today, which you'll either will have seen or will in the future see the outputs from. And we've been looking at the replicas that we have been working on together with Windlass, so Royal Armouries, Windlass and me. And these are the three swords, which are the first three swords from the second batch. Now, we've decided to take this opportunity to make a couple of extra videos for my channel on some topics that we didn't cover in the videos for the Royal Armouries. So first up, we're going to be looking at the Cinquedea. So this is the new replica Cinquedea from Windlass and the Royal Armouries, and this is the original that it's based on. So, first up, Iason, you were a fan of Cinquedea, aren't you?
I am. I love them. I do love them, Matt.
Yeah. So, how did you get interested in them, and what have you done? What have you discovered about them?
I'm not entirely sure how I first got interested in them. I think it's because of certain excellent examples that are wonderfully decorated often. You know, that they have all these incredible etchings and engravings and even gilt decorations on them. I always liked them aesthetically, and I found them a bit absurd. You know, it's not it does, as a shape, it does not conform to what you usually expect from late medieval and early modern swords. And there was something really weird and attractive about them. And I ended up doing research on and off on them, and unfortunately there's very few things that have been done about them scholarly.
Yeah, so they're absolutely characteristic, aren't they? They don't really look particularly like anything else. So for those of you who don't know, the Cinquedea is called that because...
well, it was anachronistically called that because of... possibly because of the allusion to cinque diti, the five fingers in Italian, which refers to the width of the blade at its base. However, the term is anachronistic. There's most mentions of that are from quite a bit later, from the period of the heyday of the Cinquedea, which is the sort of late 15th, early 16th century. But we can talk about its dating, the dating of the group in general more if you would like to.
Yeah, so just before we move away from the name for these, so the name Cinquedea is essentially a modern name for it?
Later.
Right,
later. Not just modern, like you do find it in sources, but they're not from the first half of the 16th century.
So we don't know what they called this?
No, like I think we speculate, based on descriptions of other things in their context, that terms such as sword or blade or even dagger would be used for something like this. And the same is applicable for many other weapon categories of the periods, because nowadays we care more about typologies and terminologies in order to discuss things, and we like, because of how our brains work, we want to put things into boxes. Yeah. But historically, somebody who would use this, I don't think that they would care about if you call this a sword. The same thing with something larger. If you call, you know, in the 15th century, a longsword, two-handed sword, hand and a half sword, they're interchangeable terms. People would know what you mean. Even if you call it a sword, if you went to a maker and you describe what you wanted, I want like one of this type. Yeah. And you described it, that I think that would be the way historically forward.
Cool. And you know, I guess, like with all historical research, you and other people are continually finding new sources, finding new things. It's possible we might find some names for these that, or maybe there are names that have been used that we don't necessarily realise yet that they're referring to these. We don't.
And imagine now that as well, like in the conversation for Modern Arms and Armour, we're conducting this discussion in English.
Yes.
And then we also alluded to this with the Italian known name. So you have to consider the typology and terminology in several languages, in the original context of the use, and also in the modern context.
Yeah.
So you get, and I think swords are not that bad for it. I think notoriously staff weapons are the absolute worst for this.
Yes.
But it is something to bear in mind, and in the end of the day, again, the name that we attach to something, we need to understand that it's more important for us discussing them today. But for historical reasons, it's interesting to see maybe the variety with which people refer to an object. And it might be more than one word.
But in the modern world, cinquedea. So you might not have known about this type of sword before, or maybe you've seen them in museums and didn't know what they were called. But hopefully you now are completely clear that we refer to this as a cinquedea, but it probably was known by various other names during the period. Now, so who was using these and when and where? Well, let's start with the when and the where, because that's sort of easier, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. The where, I think, predominantly swords of the type originate in Italy, and I think specifically in central and particularly northern Italy.
Yeah.
The when is a bit trickier. We can go into why northern Italy a bit later if you'd like to.
Yeah.
But the when we can look into it based on pictorial evidence. Frescoes, paintings, some sculptures, some sketches, and illuminations of manuscripts. Now, I think the hardest thing is, first, how willing are we, from a scholarly perspective, to go as to when we define the cinquedea as a cinquedea, right? So you're holding this object. So what makes a cinquedea cinquedea? And it is that very broad blade that meets to the end to a rather mostly acute point. Sometimes it tapers suddenly.
Quite triangular sort of shape.
That triangle essentially. Yeah. And very broad blade.
And also straight edges. I'd never really thought about that before, but they never have curved edges, do they?
That's true, yeah. I don't think so.
I'd never even thought about that before, but many triangular shaped blades do have bowed out edges, but the cinquedea is always straight, thinking about it.
I think we have exceptions to it.
Okay.
We have at least one in the collection.
Oh, right, okay.
But I think you're right. Again, you cannot define a group from its exceptions.
Yeah.
You always have exceptions. But I think as a rule of thumb, they have straight edges.
But then also, of course, there's the hilt, which is very, very characteristic.
That is the other thing that is worth going into later, which is this very sculptural handle you can see in the original and replicated wonderfully in the windlass replica, which is very... there are variations in it, into shape, but I think a common denominator in cinquedeas is this multitude and combination of different shapes you get, as well as decorative elements. Now, for the dating, if we keep these two things, some hugely complicated handle and the triangular blade, I think we can trace swords like this all the way back to the 13th century. I think these earlier examples are a bit of a stretch to call cinquedeas or to place exactly in the same group, but they are, I think, definitely a precursor to this.
Relatives of
some
some
relatives,
sort, ancestors.
As I've told you before, I don't like the idea of evolution.
Yeah.
This has been perpetuated by scholars that have been very influential in the study of arms and armor, like Bashford Dean, that created these amazing sort of family trees of weapons that they go in a very linear fashion. This comes from that, this comes from that.
Yeah,
but you have this parallel development of these as well. And so I think these early 13th century swords definitely inform this form. And as we've discussed behind the cameras and on another video before, as you suggested, these might have also been influenced, and they might allude to a Roman past, a more Italian past. And that's another reason they develop in Italy. The answer is we cannot know. However, it is I do not think it's a coincidence that the heyday also coincides with that incredible surge in art and classicism in art in northern Italy. You know, what conventionally we know as the Italian Renaissance, which lasts for much longer than it does in the rest of Europe, really.
Yeah. One of the weird, just on that topic, one of the weird things I find about the design of this hilt, which to me sort of seems like it's sprung from nowhere, but as you point out, it might have, you know, ancestors which survive. But the weird thing is that you would expect northern Italians to hark back to a Roman past and therefore to emulate a gladius. And yet, I think they had a fairly good idea of what a gladius or a Sparta looked like. And it doesn't look like this. And the weird thing is that actually in the ancient in the ancient world, the closest parallels to this are actually in certain Celtic and even Middle Eastern, like even Hittite type designs of hilt that aren't particularly associated with the Italians. So I find it a real mystery.
Well, I think you're right, and the coincidence and coexistence of all of these types and technological choices, I guess. I think more than often it does not have to do with influence, but people coming to the same solution and designs through either necessity or because simply something works very well. I do find it interesting, and I do not have a clear answer to this, and I think it is one of the reasons where we can highlight why more research is needed on them.
Yeah.
To go back into the dating and to bring it to these specific examples, because these are from the early 16th century.
Yeah.
The earlier objects that we can definitely define as cinquedas in art appear in the 14th century. Okay. And usually they to go back to the idea of who used them that you asked, we find them on representations of soldiers. There's a couple of depictions of the crucifixion that you occasionally see Roman soldiers, but Romans are depicted with usually the contemporaneous equipment of the period, so not necessarily classic stuff.
Yeah.
Cinquedas, as represented in the 14th century and the early 15th century, they often have, proportionally, because again, iconography is not a photograph, has a more acute triangular shape and possibly a shorter blade.
Yeah.
So it's closer to a broad, I don't know if we can call it a dagger.
A big dagger.
Maybe we can call it a big dagger.
Yeah.
But
it should be pointed out for viewers that this is a pretty large cinqueda, and most cinqueda are not quite as long as this.
Yeah, like you definitely have a spectrum. You have some that are longer, but I think that they are an abnormality, and some are like approximately like this, that long, and maybe some even shorter from the same period. And we're talking about variations in the same period, in the early 16th century. Where you really start seeing these, and it ties in with one of the reasons I like these, and we've spoken about this before. Whereas you see this in the iconography of military contexts in the 15th century, like all the way to the end of the century. From the late 15th and in the early 16th century, you see these represented in iconography that is related to a martial non-military context. So with civilians or even the martial elite, but in a civilian context, wearing them. Now, why this happens, I cannot answer. Like others might be able to, other students of these might be able to. And Italy has some amazing scholars that have looked into these more. And I am trying to make their research more accessible. But my speculation on this has to do with the size of the blade, because it lends itself as a shape, as a size, both the blade and the scabbard, as a canvas to demonstrate both decorative techniques and various decorative motifs. So in the Royal Armouries collection, we have examples. I don't know if you want to put any links of these. I can send you the links. Examples of cinquedas with incredibly etched, engraved, and or gilt designs along the blade, or with even more complex fullers than this. We can talk about the fullers on this if you want a bit later, but this one has 3 fullers merging into 2 later on. But we do have a a very popular design of 16th century cinquedeas, where on the base it has 5 or even 7 fullers, and then progressing into less and less, like 5 into 3 into 2 into 1.
Yeah.
So the fuller itself becomes part of the design, and it still serves the function of making the blade lighter and stiffer, but at the same time is decorating it with the shape of it. The other thing is that the decorative sculptural handle of the cinquedea, even when sheathed, even when an object does not have that amount of heavy decoration on it, it can act as a sort of demonstration of sculptural elegance, because you can see the form of this. It's absolutely wonderful. It's very subtle. It has both curves and angles, and they're blended all wonderfully together. And you can see this in the replica as well, where of course the missing material from here with time have been smoothened out, and you can see this, and it's a very elegant object in general. And this ties in with various aspects of decoration that you would have on the handle. In the case of this, the hollow rivets that hold together the 2 plates on the tang are decorated with these motifs. I don't know how, these geometric.
Yeah.
You describe them nearly architectural.
Yes, they kind of look like church windows, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Gothic.
They really do.
They're a bit like mosaic pins found in modern knife making.
Yeah. But you do have cinquedeas from the same period, again from the early 16th century, that are decorated either with precious stones or even some coins that we briefly discussed behind the cameras as well. And the coins are particularly interesting because we have sources that talk about the replacement of precious stones in the 16th century with coins. So somebody plucks out the stone, inserts a coin, and in our discussion, and I think that's an interesting thing that I hadn't really considered as a duality, the coins inserted in some cases are ancient, they're Roman. In some others they are contemporary to the sword. But that use of an ancient coin plays back to that idea of identity and allusion to something older that
we do have a parallel there, don't we? That some wheel pommels have a coin inserted in them. There's a couple of famous Italian examples which have old coins inserted in the wheel pommel.
Yeah. I am discussing this and the reproduction of both the handle and the fullers in this replica. I know I'm biased with this, but I was impressed seeing this. And the other thing that is worth mentioning as well that we see in the replica about the construction of these things has to do with the structure of the whole sword together, where the quillons are made of 2 sandwiched pieces.
Yeah.
So the shoulders of the blade can be seen. I don't know if we can do a close-up later. The shoulders can be seen out here, projecting right at the base of the quillons. And this, of course, have been ground and polished together.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting, almost box-like construction for that crossguard.
I don't even want me to round up the question, because that was a very long-winded answer. So possibly, most likely, early 14th century into the 15th century, into this form reaching and becoming a thing into the 16th century.
So this form, as you're used to seeing it, is really an end of the 15th into the early 16th century. So what about 1490 through to about 1540, something like that?
Yeah, I would say so. And then the origin, I would say, without a doubt, very popular in northern and north-central Italy, but they were used and exported in other places as well. We know that England buys things from northern Italy at the time, so we're not entirely sure when this arrived in Britain. However, the maker was from northern Italy. Now, if as a shape originated in northern Italy, I would say most likely.
Yeah.
And as to who used them, I think initially they are, again, based on pictorial evidence, military professionals and soldiers, as suggested by the iconography, but this representation is expanded in the 16th century and is definitely used in civic contexts as well.
So a couple of things that came to my mind which we didn't discuss in the other video we did is that it seems possible to me that these originally, and we lack the data to know this for sure, but it's possible that they were associated with a more localized group or area in Italy, in a similar way to how the Navaja knife was associated with the Basques, or how the Basilard was associated with the Swiss, sometimes referred to as the Swiss dagger, well, debatably the whole bone type, and possibly that source, that kind of data is just not available to us at the moment. So the way I sort of wonder how this fully evolved hilt form came out is possibly it did evolve in a particular little place and then suddenly got popular, and that's why it suddenly appeared everywhere fully formed, and then got unfashionable again and disappeared again. But, you know, it's just an idea.
You're touching on one of my absolute favourite subjects when it comes to arms and armour, which has to do with how we tie an object, in this case, a piece of weaponry, to the identity of a localized group. I find this fascinating, and we have examples of poleaxes, of halberds, of certain knives, as you say, with the navaja and so on, that are linked to certain groups.
The Katzbalga.
The Katzbalga, of course, that are very strongly associated with identity and the expression of certain forms of either nationalism in certain cases, or the formation of later national identity in the 19th century.
Or even a particular military group, like the Landsknecht or the Schiavona in Venice.
If you're going to do an episode on the Schiavona at some point, like, it is something I also find, it has many parallels in the study and the lack of evidence with the Cinquedea. They're both swords that they appear in so many collections. We have so many excellent examples, and there's so little work on them.
Well, maybe the watchers would like to see a replica of a Schiavona. If you do want to see that, then get posting down below, and we'll see if there's an appetite. There we go. We've already got one of a Schiavona.
So, for me, like I cannot know if this originated in a specific part or if it was associated with a group. But the closest thing to this I can offer is makers, the known makers, or rather certain known makers and workshops that are also decorated cinquedeas. We know they were from northern Italy, from Brescia or from Milan.
Right. And Brescia, of course, in the modern world is famous for making, like I think Beretta is based in Brescia. They're famous for guns, but originally Brescia was famous for armour, for swords, for everything to do with the arms industry. But even in the modern world, they're still making firearms.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well, the same workshops. I had worked on an article recently on one of our partisans, and I went this rabbit hole of looking into marks and workshops from northern Italy, because the partisan was from northern Italy. And I found that I identified 3 specific workshops that what they made, I mean, they could have made other stuff as well, but they've made a lot of partisans and a lot of cinquedeas. And they collaborate with the same goldsmiths that decorated the blades as well. So it's interesting to see this, and of course, when you see the blades of the cinquedea, until somebody points it out, you say, "Oh, this looks like a partisan," but then it becomes suddenly obvious. Yeah, of course, the same people would make both partisans and cinquedeas.
And you told me that earlier, and it was a kind of mind-blowing moment, because it's like I have never looked at a cinquedea, because the grips are so characteristic. They kind of dominate how you see them. But if you just now look at the blade, and even the shape of the guard,
It goes straight into the winged
yeah, it looks like a partisan. So we often talk about partisans and glaives as being like a sword on a stick. Well, you could reverse that. You could say this is a partisan without the stick.
On the handle. and just to tie this all together, because I think it becomes more interesting, like specifically the mark on this Cinquedea, which I think we replicated on the replica as well.
Maker's mark.
The Maker's mark, yeah. Well, we can debate if that's a Maker's mark or a city mark or an expo mark.
Sure.
But we do find this in partisans that we know they were from northern Italy because they were part, or because of the decoration and the style. So it definitely ties in as a subject from various angles. And we have an example in the collection that you can see here in the Royal Armouries of a blade of a partisan, that the bottom bit has been cut and ground and fitted into a cinqueda.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
wow. But it looks a bit shoddy, you know, like it doesn't look very, very good.
Yeah.
But you can see how it's been repurposed, and then the tank has been drawn from the bottom.
It almost makes me wonder, because these cinquedea do seem to come out of nowhere. You know, they have ancestors, but in this form they seem to come out of nowhere at the late 15th century. It almost makes me wonder if there could have been like a partisan maker who had a surplus of blades somewhere in Italy and just kind of went, I'll just mount hilts on these things and sell them, and everyone went, wow, in the year 1490, and everyone went, I want one of those, a partisan on a hilt.
I mean, it could have happened the other way around as well.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
At some point, because the partisan is also a complicated subject, because its form changes. So the early 15th century and the late 14th century partisans are very different to the 16th century ones.
And they don't all have the... And, you know, but I mean, just really to say that sometimes these things which are lost to history, you know, sometimes one maker or one town deciding to do a certain thing, it can have these ripple effects that go out. And if we don't have the written source or the, you know, archaeological evidence to show it, then we'll never know.
What I also find interesting, and I find this... humbling in the sense that it often makes me feel like an idiot. You know, we talk about all these things that we do not know, and suddenly you'll meet a colleague or an art collector in a random part of the world, and they'll say, no, you're full of it right now. We know exactly what that is. Here's the evidence. And they're like, oh, cool. But I think it's a...
But we're all here to learn.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, maybe someone out there knows some Italian source which talks about these things.
The closest thing that I found to sources from the early 16th century, and again, it might be interesting to some of your viewers, the closest thing I found to a source, because we do not have specifically a fight book talking about these, sources of the period do not refer to them by name, so we do not know exactly where they are. However, one of my favorite type of sources are coroner reports.
Oh, right, yes, yeah.
Because, and it doesn't mean necessarily that somebody was killed by them, but when there's an incident usually in a city, and Italian cities have incredible archives, you get a mention of the weapon that was used, or a description even of the weapon that was used in a violent crime.
Yeah.
And you get a description of a sword with broad blade.
Yeah.
And I can easily see how something like this is associated with a crime in, let's say, in Florence when they talk about a broad blade that took somebody's hand.
Yeah. You know, we've got the London coroner's records from the 14th century, for example, and all the way through to the 17th century, and very often, actually, our best information for colloquial period names for specific, you know, whether it's a type of backsword, they'll often say the name, and then they'll say which is a type of short sword or whatever. Yeah, so they're incredibly useful sources. I think to wrap it up, what are your thoughts on the use
regarding your question, I cannot claim martial expertise, and as much as I like historical European martial arts, I do not want to step on other people's toes in that regard. However, what I can offer is based on studying the relevant iconography. From what I've seen, and again, we cannot be certain because I can only say about, we have all this amount of art on the subject, which is not great, really.
No. There's not a lot of it.
There's not a lot of it, no. Like we cannot exclude the combined use with anything else. However, to my knowledge, this is not really shown consistently with anything else.
No.
And is used and is shown, even the early depiction of soldiers, is shown is depicted as a sidearm.
Yes.
And as we've discussed in the other video we're shooting, like this was, you see in earlier and even depictions from the 16th century worn straight down across against the buttocks of a soldier or right in the middle, rarely on the side as well. And we discussed a bit as to why that would happen, and because it would probably get in the way if somebody used a staff weapon with it. But even in depictions where you see it with in a civic context, you still do not really see it used like hanging with a buckler or even with a dagger. But I guess sometimes you see with a shorter dagger, but that is because that is an accoutrement that everybody
you would always wear in any case. Yes,
so for me, wearing it with one does not really allude to the use, combined use. It could be, but we cannot know.
So as far as I recall, all of the art where I've seen these shown, the person either only has that, or they have a polearm.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think the place that this probably occupies is similar to a Katzbalga, in that the person's primary weapon is a firearm, a crossbow, a pike, a halberd, a two-handed sword, something like that.
The sidearm, the edge weapon sidearm. Yeah.
And in that point of view, so much similar to some short falchions and hangers as well, it's an incredibly convenient and easy to wear object. It's got a hilt which is not going to get easily caught on things and get in the way. It's a nice length, and it's quick to pull out. On the note of practicality, because we discussed that a bit earlier as well, before this video. When I first saw these, when I told you that these like sort of piqued my interest, we would I would see these as a weird sculptural thing that it looks very unwieldy, and if you try and hold it with a hammer grip, that just gets in the way. Like it feels weird. And for me, it's a very, it's a good example of often our modern brain of wanting to use things in a manner that are comfortable to us. Or that we're familiar with.
Yeah. Whereas once you start playing around with a grip and using the fingers in different positions, or like with a thumb up here, and start applying your fingers in non-natural positions, it suddenly becomes very anatomic and very nice to the grip. Even I would even say nicer to a straight grip. I don't know. I can also be completely wrong, and this might be.
Well, it's all about experimentation, isn't it? And it's very likely that in period, not everybody gripped them the same way. And a lot of people make a lot of assertions about Viking era hilts, but my opinion, looking at the art and experimenting with myself, is that probably 20 different people had 20 different ways of holding them.
And having said that, there are cinquedas with completely straight grips or flared out ones.
And there's some with a pommel, with a wheel pommel. Yeah. I mean, some people, when they've got grips that confuse them, go to putting the finger over the front guard, but you can't really, I mean, I won't say you can't do it, but it's not conducive for a couple of reasons. One, because the blade is so broad, by the time you've stretched your finger that far, you've only got the very end of the finger around it. But secondly, these are all pretty much sharp down to the base of the blade. They don't have a ricasso or anything like that, so it would be a kind of crazy thing to do. But what I did notice is if you put the bottom three fingers around the grip here, you can actually put one finger up, or indeed, if you hold it like a messer, you can put your thumb up on the inside here. and it's entirely possible that they were gripping them somewhat like a German Langmesser. But
I have no idea.
it's all conjecture anyway.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to experiment with it.
Yeah. These are fascinating weapons, and I'm really glad that they're finally getting a bit more attention after sitting in cabinets for all of my life and a lot longer. But they are somewhat obscure weapons, but there are quite a lot of them around in collections, and they've got quite a lot of variation, and they're a very interesting period of history when the Italian martial classes were fighting against various of their neighbours and internally in the internal city sort of wars in Italy, and against people like the Ottomans and various other people around. So very interesting weapon at a very, very interesting time. And finally, we've now recreated one based on this example, this wonderful sword in the Royal Armouries, and that is now available, essentially, if you want to add one to your collection. Anyway, Iason, thank you so much for sharing your experience and knowledge.
Thank you
for having me. It's been great finally having you on. I've wanted to get you on the channel for a long time, so finally we managed it. And hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more from Iason, and of course you can see more on the Royal Armouries YouTube channel, which I'll link down below. But if you want to see him on here again, then give us a thumbs up and comment down below. But thank you, Iason, and thank you for watching. Cheers, folks.